Hello and welcome. My name is Matthew Marquit and this is part 2 of the Basic Unity Level Creation series. In this video we're going to talk a little bit about organization in our projects, and we're also going to cover how to create some content to start our basic map. Now, we left off in the last video with barely anything, obviously just the default main camera and the directional light that are in the scene here. But as I said, I would like to talk about organization first. And in the game industry, it is always important that we keep a organized and well-named file structure. Because we're going to create some assets and bring some other assets in, I want you to start off by creating some folders within Unity. Now, we talked about how we can create folders and how we can link back to our Windows Explorer in the other way by right-clicking and going Show and Explorer. Excuse me. And then in here we can create folders, and of course they'll show up over here. But we don't necessarily need to do that. We can even right-click on the assets here and go Create Folder, and come in here and actually type something up. So we're going to type in materials, because we're going to actually create some materials for our scene. I'm going to right-click here and we'll go Create Prefabs. And I'm going to right click and create a new folder, in this case called scripts. And these are the 3 new folders that we're actually going to use. We're going to make some content and bring in some content later. I'll explain what some of these mean and why we have them there. In fact, I have a new material here I've made by mistake, so I'm just going to delete that so you guys don't get confused. And the other thing, of course, is we can always name our files up here, and once again we'll get into that when it is relevant. But the first thing I wanted to talk about as far as creation is concerned is how we bring in some default objects. Now, up in game objects, if we come down here and you see there's like a drop down menu of a bunch of different things. There are 2D objects, 3D objects. In this case we are creating 3D objects. We're going to cover some of these things. But first things first, let's click on cube and create our cube in the scene. Now remember, if you hit F you can frame or center your object. Up here, as far as these little icons are concerned, the first one here allows us to kind of have an object selected but not really move it or rotate or scale it by mistake. There's nothing we really can do to change it. It's just kind of moving the viewport around, so when we click we just move the viewport around. The next one is the move tool, which of course we can grab on any of these axes and move around, or multiple axes at once and move them in more than one axis depending on where we click the object. Then we have our rotational tool, right, which we can also rotate on any different angle, as we can see there. Scale tool, which we can either scale completely as one, or we can do a ununiform scale by grabbing only one of the axes at once and scale the object around. And then lastly, we have our freeform controls here, which allow us to grab any of these nodes and kind of almost, you know, as I referred to, freeform, kind of move them around in any kind of almost intuitive way. Now this is based on the camera view, so if we actually rotate the camera you'll see that our freeform object actually changes based on our view, but we can kind of change it and do whatever we want. Now of course we can eyeball it, right, and we can just scale and move things to what we want, but there's another tool that we can use as we can come over here, which is our transform tools, where we can actually type in whether it be coordinates, rotational values, or scale values to get exactly what we want. So the first thing we want to do as far as this cube is concerned is to turn it into a larger object, basically the ground object, kind of as we see here, and we're going to use a scale of 50, 1, and 50. So if we grab the object and we come over here to our transform section and go under scale, if we type in 50 on the x-axis and we type in 1 on the y-axis and then 50 on the z-axis, and then we can double click over here on cube, we now have a much larger area to work with to run around. Now without any context, of course, this doesn't seem all that big because we don't have anything else in the scene, but it is a good chunk of space. Now we can name it over here so that we don't get confused. So we can either slowly double click or we can go rename over here, and we can just call this ground so we know what it is. Now in order to differentiate the ground, we don't want it to just be bright white. We can actually change the color. We can add textures, but in this case we're just going to add a color. So I'm going to quickly introduce you guys to materials. Now I'm going to jump into the materials folder that we created. and right click in there and go create and create a material. So we'll select that, and we're going to call this ground because we're going to use this for our ground material. Now the default shader, as we can see here, is known as the standard shader. This is a PBR, or physically based rendering shader. So that's why we can see things such as albedo, metallic, and smoothness. We're not really going to cover any of these things. These are more for the kind of art side of things for now. But I will cover the concept that we can actually choose other types of shaders, and we can even go to our legacy shaders. So if anyone's ever used Unity 4 or whatever, they will remember before PBR, they can choose a legacy shader and choose diffuse, and this is closer to what they would remember. But I'm just going to start and leave on standard. Now, of course, there is the standard, which does the metallic workflow, and the standard that does the specular workflow, right, as we can see there. But we're just going to leave, like I said, just standard. Now we can change the color of this by simply clicking over here and choosing a color in the palette. Now if there is a color in the scene, we can always click the eyedropper and we can use that. And actually the funny thing about the eyedropper is anything you click, even in the interface, like you see I hover over the bluish of this, I'm getting the blue color up in here. So whatever I hover over there will change. So if I want to grab the green or the yellow from that, you'll actually see it update to those colors whatever I hover over. But in this case, we're going to choose maybe a greenish for like a grass or something like that. So we'll click back on this. We'll come in here, click on green, choose a little bit of a darker green, and that looks pretty good. And we're going to apply this to our object by simply just dragging it onto the object in the scene, and now we have green. Now, if you ever update this, of course, we can change it to any color we want, and it will update in real time. Right? So if you don't necessarily like the color right off the bat, you don't have to keep it. You can just do that. All right, so now we have kind of a green ground. Now, the other thing we want to do is create some boundaries for which the players can't fall off the map. So we're going to build some walls around this floor. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to bring in another component here, or game object, and we're going to go 3D object and cube. Okay, so now we've brought in a new cube. Now this cube is under the other cube, or inside the other cube, as we can see here. And by the way, as far as moving around the viewport, if we hold down Alt and left click, we can kind of pan around, or not pan around, but rotate around a specific object. Okay, so we can grab this cube down here. All right, and I'm actually stuck in this view, so that's why I can't grab it. We'll go over here and move to our translate or move tool, and we'll move this up. Okay, and so in order for us to have a wall that is perfectly the right size, we know that this of course is 50 because we typed that in. So if we go 50, 4 and 1 in the scale, we'll get the exact size that we want. So if I come over here and scale and type in 50 for the length, and then in the height we'll do 4, so the player can't jump over it by default, and leave the last object to 1, we now have a wall piece that is right. Now we could all day try to line this up perfectly with the other, with the ground or whatever, but that doesn't make any sense, especially when there's some quick tools in Unity. Now one of the easiest ways to do that, of course, is to use, and as we have right here, hold the V key to snap. And this is to snap a vertex. So if we select our object and we hold V, you'll see that it will hover over different vertices as I move around. So I'm just holding V and it'll select these different vertices. So if I click on this and hold it, I can snap it to another vertice over here, and I know that it is perfectly aligned now. So there is no guesswork involved as far as that's concerned. Now, before we do the next step, which is going to be to duplicate an object, we do want to make sure the object is what we want. Now, if we just leave it this way, it's just going to be a white object, no texture. Maybe we can add some color to these walls too. So we can right-click, create, right, and create material. And in this one, we can just call walls. And in the walls, we can choose the color that we want. Now, you guys can choose any color that you would like. So there is no right answer. I'll pick like maybe a brownish color right here. So if you pick kind of an orange or a yellowish and you go in the darker color, you can pick kind of a more brown, and we'll use that, and I'll assign that to my wall before I duplicate the object. All right, so duplicating an object is simple. If we grab it, we can actually just select it and then hold Control or hit Control D, which is to duplicate. You'll see that we have now created a new cube over here called Cube 1. I can grab this and move this over, and just like the other one, I can hold down V, grab that, and snap it to the other side. So now we have two walls there. Now, so then we don't get actually some overlap, what I'm going to do is I am going to duplicate this one more time. We're going to hit Control D one more time to duplicate this other wall, but we're going to rotate it 90 degrees. Now, once again, we can grab the rotational tool and try to guess what it is, but we can easily come over here and see that the y-axis is what is rotating. If I just select that and type in 90, I know I have it exact. Now, if I do go to move it and use the V to snap, right, once again, so we'll zoom in a little bit here, and I hold down V to snap. Problem is we are kind of getting a little bit of, you know, the wall kind of connecting to each other. If we don't want it to kind of intersect, all we have to do is change the size of this object from 50 to 48, because we know the thickness of the walls are 1 each, so 1 on each side. So we just type in 48. And now it should perfectly fit there. Now if it doesn't, obviously you can just use your V to snap it to wherever you need. Then we can Control D this one and duplicate this last one here. And we can move it over here. And then once again, use our V to snap it exactly where we want it. So now we've got ourselves a little kind of controlled area in which the player can move around in. Now I do want to mention, just like some other programs, you always want to be aware of how the pivot is. If the pivot's kind of angled in a weird way, right? So let's just say in this object, and I move this object up here and I rotate it. Okay, so we'll rotate it something like this. Right? If it's left like this, you can kind of see how the angle is rotated. I grab the move tool, and the move tool is also rotated. So I can't move it straight down even though I rotated it. We want to change that up here by switching back and forth between global and local. Now local is what basically it is based on the angle of the object or based on the size or scale or whatever, right? And then world is always, 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 or global in this case, is always going to match the overall universal settings. So you can see right here, there's our red axis or X. It's on the same axis as we see here, and so on. So as we rotate this, this will always match this, okay? So those kind of like our world or our global coordinates. Now I'm going to undo all of these movements just to go back. So Control Z to undo. And so we have our walls there. So we talked about this, and we've gotten up to the point we can now create some obstacles. Now I expect you guys to do a little bit of your own work in here. I'm just going to throw in a couple of things, but you guys can do whatever you want. Now we're going to start once again, go to Game Object, 3D Object, and we can create other things. You don't have to just create a cube. You can put spheres or cylinders or things like that. Maybe I dump in a cylinder into the scene or whatever, right? And we can make sure that it snaps to the ground. So we can always, once again, use the V key. So we'll hold down V, grab one of those bottom ones, just snap it to like maybe a corner or something like that, and then let go of it and move it. At least now we know that the base of it is perfectly touching the ground, and that way we don't have to deal with a floating object. However, you can always, of course, go into a perfect side view. So we can click on a side view and make sure that it is orthographic, and we can go into, as I showed before, wireframe. And now we can kind of figure out that yes, it does meet perfectly with the ground, but if you want to manually move things and line them up. Also, the skybox might get in the way in a viewport like this, so we showed this before. I can shut off the skybox momentarily to move my stuff around and then turn it back on when I'm ready to see the other stuff. So we'll go back to shaded and go back to perspective. So you can put a couple of those objects in the scene, right? You can always Control D and add them. You can add and create materials for everything, so everything can be different colors. But one thing I did want to talk about too on the side here, right? We did label the ground, but we didn't label the different walls. And so each one of these are just cube. Okay, and one of the easiest things to do actually is just to create a parent object and drop all of the children into the parent object. Since all of these walls we're going to act as if they're all one piece. What we're going to do is over here we're going to right click and we can create an empty object. Now there's two ways of doing this. We can do it that way, or we can go to Game Object and create empty. But basically this object is literally nothing. It doesn't have anything in it. But we can add other objects to this. So I can rename this, right click and rename and type in wall. And I can grab all of these cube objects by holding Control and selecting them all and dropping them into the word wall. Now they'll be all subcomponents or sub-objects of this wall. So if I grab the wall itself, I can now move the whole thing together. If I rotate, I scale, all move together. However, if I ever want to move either any of them independently, I can go in and grab them one at a time and do that too. But this way it kind of organizes your scene a little bit better. All right, so it's just a good habit to do things like that. Same thing like this, we can probably just have cylinders. I can maybe just make another empty object and call it cylinder and drop all the cylinders in there just for consistency and for cleanness sake over here. Okay, now what I will do is I will come in and create another, we can go 3D object, create another cube. Okay, and we want to make sure that this cube 2 is snapped to the ground, so I'll hold V, snap it over here, and then move it back in. Okay, so we know it's on the ground. And we can scale this guy up a little bit, so we can grab the scale tool here and we'll use the ununiform scale both directions, kind of like this, creating a little bit of a platform. You can have it intersect that, doesn't really matter, or maybe we can even make a jump, so the player might have to jump onto that. Okay, but obviously, even no matter what we do in here, we start throwing objects in, we start making a little maze, we start texturing them or putting materials of color on them. No matter what we do, nothing is going to matter if we don't actually have a character. So that's the next thing I wanted to talk about, is our character controllers. Now we're going to use a first-person controller. There are other controllers that came by default, but they don't work as well. In fact, even though the third-person controller looks cool, it doesn't function very effectively. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to standard assets. We're going to go down to characters, first-person characters, and then prefabs. Inside here, there's going to be this FPS controller. That's what we want. We're just going to drag it into the scene, and we're going to make sure that it is above the ground so they don't fall through the ground when we start. And there you go. So you can kind of see that this is actually multiple objects. So just like this wall over here that has subcomponent of objects, or children objects, at the FPS controller, which is our prefab, also does, as we can see here, which is a first-person character. Now this is broken up into other things. We have cameras, we have an audio listener. These are all the things that we're seeing right here, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, how do you play the game once you bring a character in? Well, it's actually pretty simple, and actually I don't want to move that independent. We want to keep those together, so I moved that by mistake, just undid that. Okay, but in order to play your game, you hit the play button up here. Now before we do that, I'm actually going to go over to game. I'm going to set maximize on play when we start playing. And I'm going to delete the main camera too, because we don't need that now. We have a first-person camera in the scene. So not to confuse ourselves. So maximize on play is important, because when you hit play, the game will load, obviously, but anything you do while in play mode will be erased once you get out of play mode. So I do this to prevent myself from making a mistake and working in the editor when I'm playing. So what does that mean? Well, if I go over here and I hit play, you'll notice that my entire screen, right, the entire of Unity anyways, is now the full window. So I don't have any boxes that can't even work, but now I can move around just like a normal game. So you can hear there's audio. I can hit the space bar to jump, right? So we can jump up onto the little pillar and so on, right? Now the other cool thing too is you can hold down shift and run. And it obviously lets you jump farther too when you're holding down shift and running. So in order to get out of this, we have to hit escape to get our mouse again, and then we can kind of come up here and click on the play to stop it. Now the scene does look a little boring, right? We're going to do a little bit more to it, and I do expect you guys to do more to this map. But what we're going to do for this next, I do want to talk about the directional lighting, and I'll get to this in a second, the first-person controller script. We're going to talk about the lighting in the skybox quickly, and then we'll hit that up next. So the directional light itself is this object here. Now this, it doesn't matter where it is in the scene. This kind of acts like a sun or a moon, depends on where it is. And you can actually change the time of day based on the rotation of this. So if I rotate this, you'll actually see that the skybox will change. We can get a dusk or even a nighttime looking scene based on which direction this is facing. Now we're not getting any shadows, and you do notice if we actually look in the sky, there is an object that represents the sun, so as you rotate it, it will move with your directional light. But there are no shadows going on, so that looks a little bit boring. So by default, if you actually select the light, there are no shadows. You can add shadows by coming over here to the inspector and checking out the shadow type. Default, like I said, is no shadows. We can set it to hard or soft. Hard shadows are just that. They will look in some cases a little pixelated. There is no soft edges to them, but they calculate easier, so they're a little bit better on the performance. So if you have a lot of stuff going on and you're having performance issues, or you want it to run on pretty much more computers or whatever. We'll set hard shadows. Otherwise, we'll choose soft shadows because they look a little bit nicer, but they are a little bit harder to render, right, and cost a little bit more on the resources. But these will also update real time as we move our light around, right? So now it's a little bit more interesting. So if I go to play, you can see here I now have some shadows in the scene. You can jump around and move and whatever. So I'm going to hit escape, get out of this. And so the last thing I did want to talk about, so depending on how you make your little obstacle course area here, you guys have pretty much free realm or free realms, yeah. You basically have anything, or you can do anything that you want as far as this free roam, I should say, or whatever, to create whatever you want. But anyways, as far as the controller is concerned, if we click on the first-person controller, there is a script on it over here, and you can see that there are some settings that we can change. Now, I'm not going to go over all of them. You can actually click and try and do different things with them, but I will cover some of them that will help you depending on how you make your obstacle course. But you can change things like your walk speed, so your default speed is set to 5 initially, and your run speed is set to 10, which is double initially. If you were to set it to something ridiculous like 100, right, obviously you're going to run a heck of a lot faster. And we can also change jump speed, which is a little deceiving. It's not actually jump speed. It's kind of like your height. So if I was to change this to say something 50, which is also ludicrous, we'll see what happens when we actually play. So I'll hit play. Because it's set to run, obviously when I start walking, it'll be normal. However, if I hold down shift, holy heck, that's quick, right? So that's probably not as high as you want it, but keep in mind that is a controllable thing. Also, if you hit spacebar now with it set to 50 instead, you see that I can jump pretty ridiculously high, right? And by the way, the first-person controller thing's a little weird. If you hit jump at any point while you're already jumping, when you land, you will just automatically jump again. So keep that in mind. It is like this little bit of a bug kind of in how this thing works. But you can alter how you move around a little bit with your character in there. But obviously don't do these numbers. These are just ridiculous. But just to show you what you can do to change it. So anyways, those are the basics that I wanted you guys to know in this second part. In the third part, we're actually going to create a collectible object that our character can grab. And that will conclude this simple lesson. Either way, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.